I'd like to call to order this regular meeting of the Lancaster County Planning Commission of August 30th, 2017. A printed agenda is available outside the hearing room, and a copy of the full agenda, including the staff reports, is available at the front of the chambers with the clerk. The Open Meetings Act is posted just inside the doors at the back of the room. If you are parked in the parking garage across the street to the north, please be sure to pick up a parking coupon on your way out for free parking. I think they're right up there. And out of courtesy for those attending this meeting, the commissioners and the staff, cellular phone usage is not permitted in these chambers during any portion of this meeting. We will appreciate your cooperation. Please note that the Planning Commission action is final on the following agenda items. Item 1.1, Comprehensive Plan Conformance number 17013. Item 1.5, Special Permit number 17029. Item 1.6, County Waiver number 17003. And item 4.2b, which is Special Permit number 17030. Any aggrieved person may appeal final action of the Planning Commission to the City Council by filing a notice of appeal with the clerk within 14 days following the action of the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission action on all other items is a recommendation to the City Council or the County Board. The first item of business today is the approval of the minutes of the regular meeting held August 16th, 2017. Is there a motion?
Move approval, Core.
Second, Beckius.
Please call the roll.
Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear?
Yes.
Motion carried 8-0.
The next item of business
Sorry,
is
7-0.
The next item of business is the consent agenda. Items on the consent agenda will be called at the same time and will not be scheduled for a separate public hearing unless there is a request from someone wishing to speak or at the request of a commission member. I will ask Jerry to read all of the consent agenda items into the record. Once those items are read, she will ask if there is anyone wishing to speak. If you wish to speak on an item on the consent agenda, we would ask that you stand and state that item. That item will then be removed from the consent agenda and scheduled as a separate public hearing under Section 3 of today's agenda. All items remaining on the consent agenda will be voted upon in total with a motion for approval. Jerry, will you please call the items on the consent agenda?
Yes, thank you. Item 1.1 under consent agenda is Comprehensive Plan Conformance number 17013 to review as to conformance with the 2040 Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan, a proposed conservation easement to preserve the flood storage capacity and natural resources of the easement area on property generally located at 1821 Yolande Avenue. And I would note that this is final action by the Planning Commission unless appealed to the City Council within 14 days of today's action. Item 1.2 is Comprehensive Plan Conformance number 17014 to review as to conformance with the 2040 Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan, a proposed amendment to the 48th and O Street redevelopment plan to create the skate zone redevelopment project. The proposed project area consists of approximately 2.2 acres and involves the demolition of existing buildings and construction of a 4-story hotel with approximately 84 guest rooms, a 5,600 square foot retail building, surface parking, and associated intersection and right-of-way improvements, generally located at 300 North 48th Street. Item 1.3 is Comprehensive Plan Conformance number 17015 to review as to conformance with the 2040 Lancaster County Comprehensive Plan, a request to declare city-owned property as surplus for the eventual sale of said property, generally located adjacent to Layton Avenue between 43rd and 45th Streets. Item 1.4 is change of zone number 16036A, and that does correct an error. It was advertised as 16063A, so there was a typographical error there. Amending the Wilderness Hills Commercial Planned Unit Development to add motorized vehicle sales and repair service, early childhood care facilities, academies, and private schools as allowed uses, with a waiver to side yard setbacks on property generally located at at the southeast corner of 27th Street and Yankee Hill Road. Item 1.5 is special permit number 17029 to allow for an exception to the maximum height permitted in the R8 residential district to allow for a church bell tower on property generally located at 1213 H Street. This is also final action by the Planning Commission unless appealed to the City Council within 14 days of today's action. And the last item under consent agenda is item 1.6, which is county waiver number 17003, requesting to waive section 4.08D of the Lancaster County subdivision regulations to allow a lot to exceed the maximum depth of 3 times the average lot width on property generally located at 16600 South 82nd Street. This is final action on this item unless appealed to the county board within 14 days of today's action. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on these consent agenda items?
I see none.
Is there anyone here wishing to speak on any of these consent agenda items? If so, please stand and state that item.
Okay, seeing none, we'll entertain a motion for the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second. Washington.
Thank you.
Okay,
Ready to call the roll?
call the roll, please.
Okay, Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear.
Yes.
Motion carried, 7-0.
There are no requests for deferral, so we will now proceed to the public hearings. The staff will make a brief presentation. The applicant will then be requested to present his or her testimony, followed by those who wish to testify in support, and then followed by those who wish to testify in opposition. The staff will then be given an opportunity to respond to the testimony, and then the applicant shall have an opportunity for rebuttal. Each person testifying should state their name and address and shall have 5 minutes to speak unless additional time is requested and granted. The timer will go off after 4 minutes, then you will have 1 minute to wrap up your testimony. The Planning Commission will vote immediately at the close of the public hearing unless the commission votes to defer action or continue the public hearing. Jerry, please call the first public hearing item.
Okay, item 4.1 is text amendment number 17012, amending chapter 27.72 of the Lincoln Municipal Code relating to the zoning ordinance height and lot regulations by amending section 27.72.120 to provide that an accessory building attached to the main building by an unenclosed deck or walkway shall not be considered part of the main building and subject to the height and yard requirements of the main building, and repealing section 27.72.120 of the Lincoln Municipal Code as hitherto existing. Staff recommendation is for approval. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on this application?
See none. Brian.
Good afternoon, Brian Will, Planning Department. This text amendment simply adds one line to one section of the zoning ordinance. And maybe to kind of explain it or illustrate it, I'm just going to use the site plan that was submitted by the applicant. This is this was not initiated by staff, however, staff does support it, but it was brought to the attention of the Planning Department by an applicant who was trying to get a building permit. And trying to get a building permit for what is crosshatched here in red. This is simply a walkway from an elevated deck to a swimming pool. The circumstance here, let me use this as a way of then explaining the ordinance. On the site plan here, we have the house, which is the principal dwelling. In the backyard, there's an above-ground swimming pool that's approximately somewhere between 3.5 to 4 feet off the ground. And so the zoning ordinance would treat the house as the principal structure, and it has its own set of setbacks that apply to it. Things in the backyard like a pool or a detached garage or storage shed have a different set of setbacks that apply. However, if you create some sort of connection between the two, if you attach the two, you connect the two, then the greater setbacks of the principal dwelling would then apply. And what would happen in this case is that because the swimming pool is located in the rear yard, it's only 5 feet away from the fence line, the property line, instead of 20 feet. We've then created essentially a zoning violation because it becomes part of the principal dwelling, which has a 20-foot setback. And so I'm not suggesting this is an interpretational correction. What I'm suggesting is the way the ordinance was originally written, it did intend to prevent a house from being attached to a garage, which was maybe 2 feet away as allowed from a lot line and located in the rear yard. Prevent those two from being attached by some sort of enclosed, something that could perhaps be finished off in some sort of living space. And for all practical purposes, the two are joined and become one structure. That would have been the intent for this section to prohibit. What we have before us here today is, in the case of this property, we have a daylight basement. The deck is about approximately 4 feet off the ground. And simply attaching them by means of a walkway, we don't think was ever the intent of this provision in the ordinance. So we've simply added a sentence, one line to it that says, an accessory building attached to the main building by an unenclosed deck or walkway shall not be considered part of the main building. So that we make it clear, because previously the way it was written, this sort of attachment by a unenclosed walkway could be argued to be connecting the two and therefore would have been prohibited by the ordinance. So like I said, I think in our mind it more than anything clarifies that this notion of connections between a principal dwelling and some structure in the rear yard does not apply to everything. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that the commission might have.
So are we considering a pool an accessory building?
No, it's a structure though. And for the purpose of things located on our property in yards, the setbacks would apply, okay? And so in the case of this one, this example here, a pool is a structure, is considered the same as an accessory building like a garage or a storage shed.
So essentially, if they put in more of like a breezeway to a garage because it would be enclosed, that would still be prevented under this.
Correct. Yes, exactly, yeah.
And is the distance from the house 5 feet or 6 feet?
If it's more than 6 feet away, then it's not considered part of the principal dwelling. If it's less than 6 feet away, it is, whether it's connected or not, okay? Now, this one happens to be more than 6 feet away, so it's separate. So it's a separate detached structure.
Okay, that was confusing. I looked at the two memos that were attached in the record. The application memos referenced 5 feet, and the first memo referenced 6. And then when I saw that I could see that the walkway was longer than 5 or 6 feet, but the width of the walkway, even though it appeared narrow to me, had a notation of 5 feet on the drawing. And I wanted to understand how it was, if it was in violation right now, and we were trying to correct something?
Okay, no, I'm sorry.
Okay.
This is a proposed, so it's not constructed. I don't have actually a dimension for this walkway currently. My belief is that it would be more than 6 feet away.
It looks
Okay.
like it.
And so for the purpose of the ordinance today, it would not be considered part of the principal building, principal dwelling.
How's this historically been interpreted? Has it always been thought to prohibit this type of a project, or has there been varying interpretations?
No, as far as I know, now the planning department doesn't see all the building permits that go through. but this one was flagged and denied. So my understanding is that this has been the interpretation for forever. Okay, so that if this had been applied for in the past, it would not have been allowed.
If this homeowner had wanted to put in a ground level walkway, that would have been
That would have
permitted.
been different. That would have been different because this is more than 36 inches off the ground. That changes things.
So they would have been allowed to do a ground level sidewalk
Yeah, you can do
without worrying about
you can do
this.
something at ground level. Yeah, I don't think there'd have been an issue had all of this been at grade.
Or anything less than 36 inches.
Yeah.
How did you guys decide to go this route with amending the ordinance instead of doing something like a special permit or waiving the 5 feet setback? It'd be more than 5 feet if this is attached.
Well,
the
we
20.
think that, I mean, here again, I think as we've looked at it, I think the planning department thinks that this sort of attachment, this sort of facility in the backyard is not the sort of thing prohibited. I mean, a walkway from a deck to a pool, that should be the sort of thing that's allowed. It doesn't constitute the attachment of the principal dwelling to some accessory structure as is worded and described in the ordinance. This isn't what it was talking about. So I think from our standpoint, this sort of thing should be allowed, but that we need to clarify in the ordinance so there is no more confusion. Had we suggested to these folks, just go to the Board of Zoning Appeals, see what happens there, well, it's 50-50 whether it be approved, and even if it were, it doesn't fix it for the next person that comes along. Same circumstance, we'd have been back taking them to the Board of Zoning Appeals. Our feeling is that this should be allowed. This is the sort of thing you should be able to do in your backyard, in your deck, your pool. This is the sort of thing property owners should be able to build and have.
I guess I'm still kind of blown away by the fact that, I mean, I have no problem with this because it's going to a pool, but what if it was going to a garage that had like a second story? Because
It's unenclosed. If it meets requirements of the ordinance, it'd be allowed. Yeah, I mean, not enclosing it, I mean, in our mind, doesn't constitute, a physical connection, joining of the two. So maybe you want some way to get, I mean, the circumstance you're describing, I have a hard time envisioning that
someone
in
wanting
neighborhoods that I
that.
can picture and link. As soon as I say that, though, somebody's going to bring up that circumstance, but I can't picture that off the top of my head.
Thank you for asking that. I was wondering what the unintended consequences might be of changing the ordinance and what we might see in the future. Because it's up to the, permits to be watching this very carefully to make sure that we don't get some odd thing.
But to that point, this is an unintended consequence that we're talking
Yes,
about right
this is
here.
one unintended
This was,
consequence.
as you said, probably never intended to prohibit in the
That's-
code. It's
that's
just
our
been
thinking.
interpreted that way by,
Right, because of the way the text is worded. I mean, it doesn't allow for this sort of thing with the wording. So with this specific exception, this would be allowed. I think this is a reasonable and customary and normal, typical sort of thing a property owner may want to do in their backyard.
Other questions for Brian? Okay, is there testimony from the applicant?
I don't know if, it doesn't look like the applicant's here. Maybe if I can just say a couple words on the applicant's behalf. Part of the reason the applicant is trying to do this is due to the fact that the owner, the applicant, is disabled, is in a wheelchair. And this was an attempt to be able to make the pool more accessible with the applicant and his kids, to the applicant in a wheelchair. I mean, otherwise, it would have been very difficult. I mean, some had mentioned, well, go ahead and build a ramp. Well, you'd have had perhaps, to meet a slope that would be adequate for a wheelchair, you'd have ramps that would just have been incredibly long and burdensome for one. I don't see that as really being, a feasible response to the question. But this is where it came from, and this is what drove the applicant to seek a building permit to make this connection. So, like I said, doesn't look like the applicant is able to make it down here today.
Okay. Is there testimony in support of the application? Is there testimony in opposition to the application? Are there additional questions for Brian? Okay. Entertain a motion.
Move approval.
Second, Finnegan.
Okay, discussion?
It's almost a stretch to call this an amendment because it seems more like a clarification of what was originally intended, but it's obviously necessary, or we wouldn't be talking about it here. So I think it makes sense for the applicant. It makes sense as a general rule. It shows how important it is to have periodic reviews of the code. And we've seen that from this planning department, and I applaud that. Everybody benefits when we have clear and understandable code that can be enforced correctly. And sometimes we have to wait for unintended consequences to make the code better. I sort of regret that the applicant has to apply before two bodies to do what was probably originally intended anyway, but hopefully the applicant can take comfort in the fact that it'll be a better code when we're done. And sometimes when things don't seem to make sense, it's because they don't make sense. And this was a perfect example of that.
I too am going to support this because I had it coded down as common sense. This is something that we just need to do to clarify. So I'll be supporting it.
Others? I agree. I think this is just a great common sense implementation, and I'm going to support it as well. Call the roll, please.
Okay. This is a motion for approval of text amendment number 17012. Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear.
Yes.
Motion carried, 7-0. Okay, next item, actually, we have associated items. The first one being item 4.2A, changes zone number 17020 from P Public District to R4 Residential District with landmark overlay on property legally described as Lot 3, St. Francis First Edition, generally located at 2202 South 11th Street. Staff recommendation is for approval. And the associated special permit number 17030 to foster preservation of the former St. Elizabeth Hospital Nurses Home, formerly known as Trabert Hall, by permitting its utilization for offices or dwelling units or for some mix thereof under the provisions of section 27.63.400 of the City of Lincoln zoning ordinance on property generally located at 2202 South 11th Street. And I would note that this too is final action by the Planning Commission unless appealed to the City Council within 14 days of today's action. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on these items?
See none.
Ed Zimmer, Planning Department. I'll see if I can be briefer than Jerry's introduction, which was all necessary. Two items coming to us from the county board. This is in preparation for the sale of Trabert Hall. In devising the proper situation by which they could sell, P public zoning cannot continue. It has to be in public ownership and use to be zoned P. In discussion between Planning Department and County Board, are for the adjacent zoning of the residential section, both west and south of the building seem to be the most appropriate zoning of the land, but not a particularly appropriate zoning of a 5-story building. By the addition of the landmark overlay, we can recognize the existence of the building, and then accompanying it with a special permit, the building can be offered either to continue the use it's been in since the 1970s of office, or to revert to residential, which it was of a special category of residential, but it was originally residential, or some combination of the two, really offering a flexible package, any of which seem to be consistent with the building and not invasive on the neighborhood, really continuing the kind of uses it's been in since the 1920s. So it's a package preparing for that next step. It might be back to us in the future as somebody adjusted that, but there also on-site is an ample amount of parking for either of those uses, so we feel like we're not overburdening the setting or the neighborhood. With that, I'll show a couple pictures because I think you expect me to. So of course, beginning with the setting, it's tucked well back behind what functions as a parking lot for for Malone Manor, for Lancaster Manor, now Lancaster Rehab Center. There's an access easement across that property and an easement for some of the adjacent parking immediately in front of Trabert Hall to be public parking. That's not dedicated to either building, but can be used by either use. What I think the building as a landmark really illustrates is what we used to have on the site, which was a very large hospital complex, perhaps the largest square footage in Lincoln in the 1920s when it was essentially built out and when Trabert Hall was built. It's a 5-story building set tucked back behind what was a very large complex of hospital building attached, and this building was attached by a tunnel under that parking lot in its original nurses' home, nurses' residence use. It's, of course, the building at the back. It gained an addition on the east side of that U shape. I think architecturally it qualifies as a landmark. It's a handsome work of a Kentucky firm, DX Murphy and Brother, who were specialists in hospital construction, and it's kind of a modified Gothic revival in brick and limestone. And I'll finish that with their nice drawing for the building, depicting exactly what was built and what still, except for that addition, really remains as the exterior appearance of the building today. And then Mr. Trabert, who was the director of the welfare department, when that's what the county called its human services branch, and would have been in charge of Trabert Hall during most of his tenure with the county. Before that, he had been about 30 years with the State Division of Welfare, and upon his retirement, it was named Trabert Hall, and I think that's how most people recognize it today. And then just a quick glance at what really is kind of a provisional site plan. We have to have a site plan attached to the special permit, but we can't design how some buyer might make adjustments or possible additions. But this is essentially the setting today with that easement that connects it as a kind of an exit driveway onto the residential street south of it, but the principal use is really across the parking lot and the public easement from South Street. That's the package. It's a typical landmark, just in a little bit of an unusual approach that it's not a developer bringing it to you, but rather the seller preparing it. And the seller is us as the county board, and they should be positioned to make a fair offer of it for a fair appraised price. And that's what brings you the package.
Okay, questions for Ed?
I do have a question. You mentioned a couple of easements, one for access, I'm assuming from South Street and across the property, and one for parking. Could you, I could figure out where the access for easement was, but could you describe where the parking easement is?
To the best of my knowledge, I will. And these are existing easements already in the underlying subdivision of the area. I think the public parking easement is the parking immediately north of Traybert Hall.
Okay.
And it's probably largely used by Lancaster Rehab Center, but it is associated with the access easement across that ground. And it is not included in that approximate count of 120 stalls associated directly with this property on the parking lots to the east.
Okay.
So neither building can, by the easement, can claim it as directly their parking. It is all of our parking.
Thank you.
But it's front door parking for Traybert.
Maya?
So this is basically a placeholder permit. And then your best sort of guess of what a developer might want. And then the thought is that they might come back and suggest some changes within the realm of what you have put forth today.
And this is quite flexible in enabling either a mixed use between office and residential, or a single use of office or residential for the whole building, either which seems to be accommodated by the available parking, and some leeway for the planning director if they came in with a mix to recognize it was within this general action. If it were something else, there are certain limited abilities to amend a special permit administratively. If it changes the underlying intent, then that would come back for a full amendment. But it's trying to position it so somebody looking at it has a fair idea of what they'd be trying to buy.
Thank you.
With the historic overlay, will the exterior of the building remain the same and just the interior be remodeled? Is that how it works?
The guidelines that accompany it are the standard Secretary of Interior guidelines for historic rehabilitation. And if somebody were doing a development to access any of the tax credits that could be associated with a qualified historic rehab, they would be following those guidelines. In the landmark designation, it would be just the exterior addressed. If they were doing a full redevelopment, any character features, character defining features of the interior could also be covered, but not by our procedures, but rather by the optional choice into the tax credit realm.
Okay, thank you.
Any other, Tracy?
I noticed that it talks about, in the staff report, that a condition of this is, that it has to, let's see here, a more specific dimension site plan has to be provided from whoever buys this. But where, I didn't see, is that condition needing to be on the special permit conditions? Because I didn't see it there, and so I was just wanting to make sure that it was where it was supposed to be.
I think it is in the action you would take, which if you chose to adopt the staff report recommendations, I think it's there, which I think is where you'd want it. I'd mention the special permit would be final action. The landmark would not. That's an ordinance. It has to go on to city council. So there's a condition of that final action that has to be satisfied by city council's action. So it's final in terms of the special permit, but can't be used until a landmark designation accompanied it.
Okay.
Ed, I think I read that once something starts to happen with this, that the Urban Design Committee will be reviewing plans, not the Historic Preservation Commission, wouldn't they?
Yes.
Okay, maybe I
As a
misread
standard
that,
with a
but-
landmark.
Yeah, okay,
If I said the other, I was wrong.
yeah. Well, you're never wrong.
No, I'm frequently wrong, and then
I
I'm
misread,
corrected.
I misread it. I'm sure I misread it.
You may have misread a mistake I made.
Yeah. Any other questions for Ed?
No, I am very pleased with this. I really like how you put the landmark, you've proposed the landmark overlay with the zoning, and then you've gone ahead and provided all the guidelines, so that anyone wanting to purchase this property would know right off the bat what they would need to do in order to move forward.
I think we're working with a good client.
Yeah.
Well, it
I
seems
think
to
you
be
are too.
Speaking of which, is there testimony from the applicant? Very good.
Good afternoon, Mr. Scheer and members of the Planning Commission. My name is Kerry Egan. I'm the Chief Administrative Officer for the Lancaster County Board of Commissioners. I'm here to testify on behalf of Lancaster County Board in favor of change of zone 17020 and special permit 17030. Lancaster County acquired Trabert Hall in 1969 as part of the county's purchase of the old St. Elizabeth's Hospital. Since that time, Trabert has served as an office building for numerous county agencies, including the County Attorney's Child Support Division, the offices for Lomar, General Assistance, Veteran Services, and state agencies such as adult probation. However, both the county and city master building plan and the comprehensive plan call for consolidating governmental services in the downtown area. With the completion of our remodel of the old county jail over here at 605 South 10th Street, the county was able to relocate the remaining agencies in Trabert to the downtown campus. Since the county no longer has a public use for Trabert Hall, the county board is now in the process of declaring the property as surplus and selling it at a public sale. Through this process, the board hopes to, of course, sell the property at the highest possible price for the benefit of our taxpayers, while at the same time guaranteeing that the future use of the property will be compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. The county board believes R4 zoning with an historic overlay and landmark designation and an accompanying special permit allowing continued use of Trabert as an office building, for which it's been used for almost 50 years, or residential, or an appropriate mix of residential and office, is the best approach to accomplish these goals. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions? No? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there testimony in support of this item? And I might add, both items, if there is testimony in support for either or both of the items, do that now as one testimony, please. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Amy Fish. I'm the administrator at Lancaster Rehabilitation Center, 100 South Street. And I just wanted to tell you that we're thrilled that we'll have new neighbors. And we are in support of changing the zoning from P public to R4 residential. However, the concern that has been raised by those who own our campus is the public easement. And the public easement was fine with them when Trabert Hall was a public building and zoned as public. When it becomes private property, zoned R4, owned by a private individual, what is the need for a public easement, and does that go away, both to South Street and in our parking lot? So I just wanted to raise that as a concern, and it's something that they're investigating and looking into further, but I just wanted to make sure that that was noted for the record, that that's our only concern with the sale of this property. So, thank you.
Thank you. Is there other testimony in support of either or both? Okay, is there any testimony in opposition to either or both of these items? I don't see any. Are there any more staff questions for Ed?
Do we have any more, can we shed any more light on the easements?
Yeah.
Or do we have all the information that we have so far?
Tom Chaka, planning staff. I don't think it was in your report, but there was a previous final plat done over this property that put Trabert Hall on its own lot. It's called St. Francis First Edition. With that final plat, the easements were established, so they are of record with the final plat. The plat shows the access easement that's sort of on the eastern end next to the chapel there. Comes in off of South Street and goes to Trabert Hall property. That's a public access easement, and then the first row of parking stalls on the north side of Trabert Hall, that has a public access and parking easement over it. So they're there because they were done with the final plat and dedicated with it.
So they will remain.
Yes.
Okay. Other questions? No? Applicant rebuttal? Applicant, okay. So we're ready to entertain a motion?
Move approval, Beckius.
Second, Finnegan.
Discussion?
I think that this is generally an appropriate use for the change of zone, considering the existing residential neighborhood. And then the special permit, I think, is taking into appropriate recognition of the use of this building for the last 45 years. I also enjoy the fact that it does give flexibility for this project to be redeveloped, and hopefully this building reused in a productive way. I'll be supporting the motion.
I like the change of zone, because it matches a lot of the existing adjacent zoning. And I think this is a smart kind of proactive approach by the county to kind of maintain a historical building in our community, and I think that's really important.
Maya?
I agree with previous speakers that I would just say with regards to the easement, it's kind of hard to make a call on it right now, and it's so conceptual, but hopefully there will be other future opportunities to express concerns when it's clear what's going in and how it will, there's a site plan and this and that. So I will support it as well.
And I want to add my support. I think this is not only everything everyone's already mentioned, but also a very sustainable approach to keeping a really important asset in the neighborhood functioning and productive. Now, we have to call these separate, or
Yes.
vote these separate, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so this would be for the approval of change of zone number 17020. Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear.
Yes.
Motion carried, 7-0. And conditional approval of special permit number 17030.
Move. Washington.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yes. Do we need a separate motion for this, I
motion.
think, yes. So Sandra,
I move.
Second, Beckius.
okay. Please call the roll.
Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear.
Yes.
Motion carried, 7-0. Okay, the next item is item 4.3, County Special Permit number 16021A for an amendment of site-specific condition number 5 regarding landscape screening requirements for an event center on property generally located at 12400 West Denton Road. Staff recommendation is for conditional approval. Are there any ex parte communications to be disclosed on this item?
I see none.
I had a conversation with Tom yesterday. I don't know if that qualifies as ex parte, but I had questions.
Noted, thank you.
Tom?
Tom Chaka, planning staff. As some of you recall, not all of you were on planning commission at the time, but a little over a year ago, we had an application in front of us for expanded home occupation to do an event center on this property here at Southwest, what is that, 126th and West Denton Road, just west of Denton. This is coming back for one item only and one purpose only, and that is to clarify a condition that was put on with the original special permit. All other conditions, waivers, etc., remain in place, so I just this is a pretty narrow focus on one item. The condition deals with landscaping screening, and it said that a 60% screen is required from the ground to 10 feet above the ground along the south and east property lines abutting any parking or outdoor area. A question came up was, does that mean that if you're doing landscaping, it has to be 10 feet tall from day one? When the question came to me, I said, well, that's wasn't the intent, and that's not how we've done it in the city through city design standards whenever we've done landscaping. We look at what's being put in on a landscape plan, we calculate it to see if it meets the 60% screen based on a landscape plant material list that we have in the city based on the mature height and spread. When I looked at this plan that they submitted with the original special permit, it met that qualification. However, the person objecting to it said, well, that's not what the condition says. We sent that planning, I sent that, had the county attorney look at it and see what his interpretation was. His interpretation was that since we didn't specifically reference the city design standards or reference how it was done, and the condition says it's 10 feet tall, then yes, it had to be 10 feet tall from day one. So this amendment is to come back and clarify that condition, that it does not have to be 10 feet tall. The other issue we have is that the county does not have landscape standards, does not have design standards with the city. So when we're taking something as a reference point, we should have been more clear in the original condition. I also wanted to state that the 60% screening from ground to 10 feet wasn't just pulled out of the air. That's actually a standard in the city design standards for commercial next to residential. That's the requirement, and that's where that came from. So in essence, this is to basically say that it doesn't have to be 10 feet tall at the time of planning. It also clarifies what exactly is a screen. Out of the city design standards, the definition of a landscape screen is a visual buffer consisting of plant material, masonry, wood, or other material approved by the planning director, and differences in land surface elevations, or a combination of these elements. So if they wanted to do a fence, that would be acceptable. Now, since a fence is 100% screen, it would only need to be 6 feet tall. 60% 10 feet tall, 100% 6 feet tall. So that's pretty much the essence of this amendment, or as somebody mentioned earlier, more of a clarification.
Okay, questions? Maya?
So the reason that this has to be clarified is because it's outside of city limits, so it's not implied that it follows
Right.
Lincoln city design standards?
Yeah, it's outside City of Lincoln's zoning ordinance.
Okay. And then I'm wondering about condition 3, simply because I haven't seen that before, and maybe I've missed it. Is this standard, or is that somewhere within City of Lincoln design standards, and that's why you're bringing it in?
Yes.
Into this
We were
condition?
trying to cross our Ts and dot our Is and not have to come back here and do this again. So we were trying to look at the design standards and look at landscaping, look at anything that might be a question mark or come up. And we didn't want to say just be in conformance with City of Lincoln design standards, the chapter on landscaping, because there's certain things in there that I don't think apply in this situation. So we put in what we thought were relevant sections from the design standards.
And is there a way to enforce condition 3?
Like we said before in other meetings, every condition on any type of special permit is usually enforced by a complaint basis. I mean, basically what 3 is saying, if you planted a tree and that was part of your requirement and that tree dies, well, you need to replant it. You need to plant another one. You need to keep that 60% screening.
Sandra?
First, let me say that I think it was I wasn't on the commission a year ago, but I think it was a really good idea, if you have commercial next to residential, to apply some kind of screening standard. So I don't have any questions about the initial permit and the conditions, and I understand this seems like a very simple change, just to clarify how large plants have to be when they go in the ground, and so I don't have any question about that. I'm really thinking a little bit more broadly. Perhaps the next time something like this comes forward, I'm looking specifically at site-specific condition number 2 and the analysis point number 3. The analysis of the original permit said that when the condition for landscape was written into the staff report, it was the intent to follow the City of Lincoln design standards, which seem fine on the surface, but I'm questioning how we move City of Lincoln design standards out into the county. Most importantly for me, I look at the plant list material that we use in the city, and I think about what the county looks like, and they're not the same environments, they're not the same, habitats and biomes, and we're used to a certain design standard within the city with lots of, trees and shrubs and flowers. And in the county, some of the areas don't look so manicured, and I don't think they should look so manicured. So I am curious about the plant list, that we not just pick up the city plant list and move it into the county and suggest that those are the right plants to put into screening in the county. And I would be very supportive of a re-look at that plant list, to be making sure that we're planting native plants or encouraging the planting of native plants should we ever reach out and suggest screening needs to happen. I'm not thinking that it all has to be open prairie. I know that we have lots of historic and not historic windrows that serve a purpose. But I think in talking with the university or the NRD or Parks and Rec or whatever, I think we could probably come up with a more appropriate plant list, so we don't try to put city landscape standards into the county without thought.
I would just say a couple of things. One, this Lincoln plant material list only applies to the city of Lincoln and within 3 miles, so it doesn't apply in the county.
Right.
We use it as a reference point. In the county, like I said, we don't have landscaping standards. We kind of look at a special permit, case-by-case basis to see if it's warranted, if it's something that should be screened or landscaped. And we might use this plant material list as a starting point, but we'd also be open to other types of plants or materials if the applicant would bring something forward. And actually, on our conditions, number 2, the last sentence states that plants not listed on the plant material list may be permitted by submitting a request to the Director of Planning.
And I appreciate seeing that caveat, but I think I'd like to also think about starting with an appropriate list of plants that might be better suited out in the county.
Other questions? No? Applicant?
Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission, I think Tom summarized this fairly well. I tried very hard to avoid having to come here. I didn't agree with the interpretation that was put on the original condition. I don't think there's ever been a circumstance anywhere in Lancaster County, at least not in the last 40 years, that has applied a standard that would require landscape materials to be planted at mature heights. Be that as it may, we're here, and so we're in agreement with the report. The applicants have moved a significant number of existing trees on the property to screen the parking area, which I guess Tom took the aerial. I'll put one up here. There we go. Zoom in a little bit. The parking area is here, where that area has been screened with cedar trees that were existing on the property. And while we got an approved landscape screen plan and put in landscaping along this area here to screen from the outdoor ceremony area that they use right here, it was, while we were in the midst of this process, we looked at the plant material that they had already planted, and there was some, if you're gardeners, you know this has been a pretty big year for grasshoppers, and the privet hedge that was planted didn't really do all that well against the grasshoppers this summer. It was difficult to find plant material that would substitute. So what has happened in the meanwhile is that instead of waiting to make sure that this application would be approved, there has been, if I can make this work, I hope I can.
Yeah.
This runs along the diagonal property line that screens from that outdoor area. So there's been a fence installed, and the only remaining question mark is that here is the landscape plan that was submitted and approved. I need to back up. And it included an area on this north-south property line which really doesn't screen anything. And in talking to Tom, had this landscape plan come in without that area shown, it would have been approved. And so we want to tell you before anybody gets confused or surprised that we intend to submit a revised landscape plan eliminating that piece of the screen, because if I can get to another photo. This is a view of looking toward the property to the east along that north-south property line, which runs right here. And this is the end, if you can see the end of the fence. There. The end of the fence is here. This is where that property line turns north and south. And there is no view of that outdoor reception area that is anywhere in sight from the adjoining property. So we intend to apply to reduce that screening in that area, or to eliminate that screening in that area. But these folks have tried very, very hard to get the property into compliance, and the fence was put up kind of as a precaution because we weren't sure what we were going to end up with here. And I think the fence obviously meets the landscape standard, and it meets it today. We believe the standard is also probably met along the parking lot with the trees that were transplanted, but we're not going to take an oath to that at the moment. It's a very well-screened area. So if there are any questions about that, we'd try to answer them.
Questions? Is the fence intended to be permanent, or is it temporary until the plants grow?
It's permanent.
Okay.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you.
Is there testimony in support? Is there testimony in opposition? Please come forward.
I am Ashley Anderson at 12600 West Denton Road, just west of the property. And we are in opposition of this amendment because it will, kind of like how he mentioned, this hasn't been an issue in the last 40 years, and that's because this is a farming community. It's zoned as agricultural. And if we keep allowing people to just come in and turn these farming communities into city communities by building event centers and bringing a lot of traffic to these areas, we're going to keep having these sort of issues and bringing these issues to these boards. Sorry, I'm a little nervous. So the next issue he mentioned was the grasshoppers were really bad this year, but they're not recordly bad. Nebraska always has bad grasshoppers. So who's to say if they plant some plants at, small plants this year and they're supposed to get to 10 feet, what if they never get there? Then they can keep operating their business, having loud music. There's already, when they were having events in the past, people regularly get lost and go and having to turn around. Like on the map, our property is like the very next driveway to turn around at. So, we're just worried about, the loud music, about not even ever getting to that proper screening and the issue and the negative effects that it's going to have on our animals and our livestock. Our property is right there. We use those front pastures with our cattle, and I know the other neighbors have already had issues with spooked horses, and that's why the screening became an issue. And now they're requesting no screening. They're just going to have more issues with our animals and our livestock. Are there any questions for me?
Thanks.
I do have a question.
You have a question.
Because you mentioned a couple of things here, and you're in opposition to any change in the screening?
Yeah, and having the screen be at the 60% screen with the trees before they have any events, not 60% eventually, because who's to say that it's eventually going to get there? I mean, like he mentioned, grasshoppers, there's always going to be some sort of issue. You could plant something this year, it could take 6 years before, whatever they plant gets to that proper height. And then what are we doing for 6 years? We're listening to all these issues and having issues with our animals and our livestock.
Where's your property in relation to the
Um,
west or east or
it's just west.
just west? Okay.
So we understand that we have a small, like a thin line of trees right here. But looking out for, like, we're not just here for our property, we're here for the community as a whole. Like, our neighbors here already had a spooked horse. We're gonna start having issues. And like I said, our driveway is right here, and it's the #1 driveway where people were turning around and when they'd miss the turn. And then they drive into our yard. We have our cattle right here in the front pastures, and, dogs are barking, and, nobody wants to have their dogs barking and cattle issues on all hours of the night in the evenings.
So you're across Southwest 126th?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there others in opposition to the application?
Hello, I'm Chet Bennett. I live at 12121 West Denton Road, so I don't have the map, but basically the second house down to the right. Yeah, sure. Right here is where I am. So to keeping this, as Mr. Chayka had mentioned, we're keeping this narrow and beyond the scope of, obviously, we don't agree with this in its entirety. We're just talking about the trees today. It was brought up in Mr. Hutzker's letter that there's confusion and uncertainty, and yet in looking back at the meeting, specifically the one on May 25th, Mr. Chayka mentions that they weren't supporting a waiver of the screening because we feel that with it being closer to screening, that there should be a requirement because of noise and light buffers, okay? And further down the road on this, at that same meeting, the question was asked about specifically the screening and that there would be trees moved in. And I understand that now we're trying to get out with the technicality of the rules of it, but this whole thing is a technicality because, as many of you mentioned, that this is not the original intent of the home occupation, the permit itself. So begrudgingly, we had to watch that process through this and then the county board, and when those requirements were put on, at least had some consolation that, hey, maybe we won't have to see as much or hear as much because there's going to be this 60% to 10-foot screening. And now that we find out that as a business owner, again, that maybe isn't researching ahead or whatever, it's going to be expensive to create that. So in the midst of creating the rules by which they're having an exception to the rules, now all of a sudden when they're figuring out that it's going to be a little bit more expensive to comply with those rules, now all of a sudden we want to change the rules by which we wrote in the first place. So I'm opposed to it, ma'am, to your question, because at least there was consolation in when these trees were to be planted, as it was mentioned multiple times in both this meeting and the county board meeting, where either Mr. Hunziker himself or Mr. Heinrichsen, in answering Commissioner Hudkin's question, to clarify that 60% screening was that you couldn't see through it. That was one of the quotes exactly, as Mr. Henriksen said. Hunziker asked, and do we mean 60% that you can't see through, or a tree cover with 60%? What would that mean? Correct, Mr. Heinrichsen, correct. You can't see through the 60%. Well, to her point, I grow trees, I plant trees every single year. This has been a bad year. Grasshoppers were horrible this year. Guess what? The trees I planted this year are not going to get to 5 foot in however many years, let alone 10 feet. So if we keep delaying this, and the intent of the rule was to ensure that there was screening to avoid noise, to avoid some of the light, to have it be so that those of us that moved out into the country to live a certain lifestyle, didn't want to move next to an event center, that we could live that lifestyle, that there was some solace in that. And now we're trying to get the rules changed again because a business owner, it's too expensive for them to plant trees or put fencing along the whole length. So that's all I have, is if there's any questions or clarifications on that.
Questions? No?
I think I've got it.
If I still have a second, one last thing, ma'am, you mentioned the materials list. Eastern cedar trees in our neck of the woods are weeds. We pluck them out. They're horrible because they interfere. They spread horribly, and they don't transplant well. So I appreciate that Mr. Hunziker said that he wouldn't say under oath that it complies with it now, because if you come on out, you'll see that not only have the grasshoppers taken out a lot of the little Arbor Day trees that you get in the mail that they planted, but it also, the trees that they tried to transplant that go along this driveway that was, covered, so to speak, according to what they were saying, most of them are going to die because you don't transplant those types of trees. I'm not an arborist. I'm not testifying to that. But if you look at them, you will see that they are not doing well. And to your point on that condition number 3 of maintaining it and all of that, I'm glad it's in there, but there's no way that any one of you or us or anyone can hold them accountable for it, because it's a complaint-based system. So then we have to file a complaint saying, well, their trees are dead. The screening's gone. The thing that we just had 2 more meetings about that we all agreed was whatever it was, now the trees are dead. So what do we do about that as residents? As the many that are around here, we're trying to make all these rules for the one, but the many of us that are around there, it's affecting all of us. It's not affecting directly that one. So that's all I have to say, unless there's questions or comments.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep. Are there any other questions for Tom at this point? Okay, I have one too.
So I just wanted to confirm, we've kind of been over this, but the original intent by planning when this condition was put forth was to comply with City of Lincoln design standards, where the planted plant does not need to be mature height at the time of planting.
Correct.
Correct, okay. And is that anywhere, and I've been trying to look at the design standards online, is that stated anywhere in the code, or is that just kind of a common practice that?
Well, it talks about planting at, I believe, I don't have it with me, but it talks about planting size, and that's in the plant material list.
Okay.
So here's your, on the bottom, as soon as it comes up. So eastern red cedar is down here on the bottom, and then you gotta pull this down on the, so over the top you have columns: planting size, method of planting, design size, the mature spread, mature height. So on the eastern red cedar, the planting size is 4 feet to 5 feet. Height is 25 feet. We were only requiring a 10-foot height. So what we're saying is the trees need to be 4 to 5 feet tall at the time of planting. When I was out there to post the zoning sign, I looked at them, and I would say the majority, if not all of them, there might be a few that are less than that, but I would say at least 3/4 of them meet that 4 to 5 feet tall system.
Tom, can you tell us when you saw those, where were those red cedars? Were they along Denton Road, or?
Yes, they are. They're on each side of this driveway, 10 or so on each side. Some of them, I would agree, some of them didn't look like they were in too good a shape. A few of them, maybe 3, 4, something like that. And the other thing I want to mention, when the original special permit was done, they had never submitted a landscape plan. That was a condition put on later. So after the fact, they submitted their landscape plan. I reviewed it to see if it meets the 60% screening based on this mature height and spread. And they actually had more than what they needed on their landscape plan. Based on the 60% screen for along the Denton Road, they would need a total of 15 trees. I believe they have more than that out there planted. So, once again, we're not waiving the screening. We're not changing that it has to be 60% from the ground to 10 feet. The fence on the east side that Mr. Hunsaker showed you, that right there meets the condition. So, like I said, all we're really doing is clarifying, do them trees on Denton Road have to be 10 feet tall at the time they're planting? Or can they be 4 to 5 feet tall as shown in the plant material list?
So, I know you didn't go out when you posted the sign to do an inspection, but in your opinion, what is there meets the quote-unquote intent? I know it wasn't voted that way, but the intent that you're describing today, at today's meeting, it meets the intent now.
In my opinion, if this amendment is approved and this new language is adopted, what they have there meets that condition.
Okay.
Now, I guess Steve just brought up H on here is the one that talks about using the percentage calculated at plant maturity.
So if we look at those planting guidelines for those eastern red cedars, they have to be 4 to 5 feet when they plant them.
Right.
And really, we only need 6 feet high to get the 60% coverage.
No.
No.
That would be if you would do 100%
Yeah.
screen. It would only need to be 6 feet tall. You'd need to do plant a lot more trees to get a
Okay.
100% screen.
But how much growth would they need? I'm not that quick at math in my head. To get to that 60 to that requirement.
Oh, the 60%? Well, 15 trees to meet the condition of the 60%, they would have to be 10 feet tall to get to it.
And they're 4 to 5 feet now, and eastern red cedars aren't fast growers, even when they're, have the best of conditions. They don't usually grow more than 3 or 4 inches in a year, and that would be a good wet year. I realize I wasn't put on the planning commission to bring my
I appreciate
botany
this.
and forestry experience, but I
So it
thought
would
might-
take a couple years to get to the full.
Oh,
Sure.
yeah, more than a couple.
And that's, I mean, I know we're not under city zoning, but that's common practice in the city when I used to review landscape plans for building and safety, and that's the way we did all of them, that even though they needed to be, design standards said you have to be a certain height, well, they don't have to be that at the time of planting.
So when you get a situation where there's a complaint, the only complaint that you can really respond to is if the screen is not performing the way it should, if it's not growing, if there's mortality and there's no replacement.
Right.
But if the screen is not to maturity, but it's growing well, it's thriving, it's still in progress, basically. That complaint would not be valid as long as they planted the correct size of plant at the time of planting.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Tom, can you provide some history as to how the applicant is making this, has come to desire this clarification? Is it because adjoining neighbors have been complaining?
The applicant didn't ask for clarification, and to be quite honest with you, if the question ever arose, I would have said their landscape plan submitted meets the condition. Like I said, the question arose, mainly, does have to be 10 feet tall? That was the question.
Sure. Who was prompting clarification?
The applicant.
The applicant.
Because they don't want to plant trees that are 10 feet tall.
Sure. So it wasn't adjoining neighbors saying to the planning department, this isn't meeting standard. This was not a complaint based, this was not initiated because of neighborhood complaints.
I would say yes.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was initiated because a neighbor complained that they weren't 10 feet tall, the trees. We looked at it. We said, well, the way it's written in the resolution, you're correct. It has to be 10 feet tall. Told the applicant that. And so we discussed it and said, that's not really, wasn't the intent at the beginning, but because it's written in the resolution, the only way you can change it is to go back through Planning Commission and County Board to amend it.
Thank you.
This really seems like this feels like this is an issue of communication. And initially, I understand the intention to provide some screening so that there would be a buffer between residential and commercial. And I can understand where a T may not have gotten crossed in making the assumption of lifting city standards and putting them into the county. I completely understand that. But I think there were a lot of people who, or at least a number of people, who came away thinking that what was written was what the condition would be, and didn't fully understand that the county may have been, I don't want to suggest that anyone didn't do their job, but may have glossed just a smidge, saying, well, of course, in the city of Lincoln, it's 10 foot at maturity. It's not expected to be 10 foot at planting. But it feels like this is where the problem is, that there was an assumption that everyone understood it was 10 foot at planting, or 10 foot at maturity, and not 10 foot at planting, but the word said 10 foot at planting. With that said, I feel like we're in a very weird situation here, because it doesn't look like a clarification, it looks like a change in condition.
David Carey with the Planning Department. You bring up a very good point about how we got to this point of needing to make a change like this. I think hindsight being 20/20 in most cases, it does apply here. I think the realization of when the question came up and we were trying to answer that question, we brought in our county attorney to look at the language, and the way that we were looking at it through the county attorney's point of view is what is written is written. Whether the intent was there or not, it wasn't spelled out as far as what the intent was. So it was a very strict interpretation of the language that was in the staff report and the condition that was passed at the time. So at that point, that's when we had a discussion about what the true intent was and what the past history of the application of this type of condition has been. And it has been historically and consistently following the city screening standard for the 60% at 10 feet. So once we clarified that with ourselves, we talked about what could we do to bring clarity to this, because it was clear to us at the planning level that that was the intent and we needed to make sure that was clear. So we talked through that, and this is the step that was needed to be taken to make sure that was clear. The other point I would just say is that we did some self-reflective points and said we should have been clear about that at the time. And our intent is to consistently be clear about that in future examples like this, so that there is no question there what the intent is.
Not to add any light where it doesn't need to be shined, but is there another situation in the county where we have lifted design standards from the city and placed them on an applicant in the county? You don't have to give an address, just tell me in general.
One that comes to mind was there was another expanded home occupation on South Highway 77 for outdoor storage for campers, boats, etc. And that one did say that screening would meet City of Design standard screening for outdoor storage. That's one that comes to mind. Screening in the county doesn't come up really all that often because you're not usually dealing with commercial in the county. It's pretty rare, so there's not a lot of examples.
Okay.
Thank you. Other questions? No? Applicant?
To the question of whether or not this was intended, I think it's, I suppose to some extent, there are those of us, including me, who have been working in this area for a long, long time and understood that that's always the way this has been applied. Had I had any inkling whatsoever that anybody thought that this was going to be a requirement that met those standards at planting, I would have objected immediately. But I don't think anybody had that in mind. In fact, to the contrary of your statement, ma'am, it was not written so that it says shall meet this standard at planting. It was written a little more generally than that, which is what everybody, I mean, had it been written that way, we'd have had a big argument about that, back when this was approved, but it wasn't. That said, I want to show you some photographs. Here we go. That have been taken of the area next to the road. There are 100 feet. There are cedar trees 100 feet on either side of the entrance drive that are out near the roadway. And those were planted, if you can see this, back in May of 2016. The transplanting of these trees has been a long time ago. There have been additional trees planted. Oops. If I can get this. Up along the parking lot. So we have essentially 2 rows of trees between the road and the parking lot. And I just want to just point out again, the screening is to be along the south and east property lines. Neither of the
We can't see what
people
you're,
who have objected today.
Can you move the image?
Oops, I'm sorry.
There you go.
there we go.
I need to back it up a little bit. Neither of the folks who have objected today will have any particular benefit from those screens. This is simply an objection again to the use, which is not the issue here today. I believe we are probably in compliance with the 60% to 10 feet. But as to these trees, I don't know for sure. We do have at least one dead tree. We have a couple that are probably not looking too hot. But as your conditions of approval have, if you read those, you'll see there is a requirement that those be replaced if they're dead and to be nourished if they're struggling. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't believe that grasshoppers are a factor when it comes to cedar trees. The landscaping I was referring to was a privet hedge that was along that diagonal property line that was planted and is not doing particularly well. And we've gone ahead and put up the fence just to be sure that we're going to be able to keep those or to meet that standard and to eliminate that source of objection to this use. So,
Can you put the second to last image of the trees that are planted? Yeah, I think it was on your phone. Can you put that? I just want to ask a question of the trees that you show on that image. Can't really tell from the camera angle. Are those 4 feet, 5 feet, 8 feet tall trees? Just what's your guess?
looking at this angle, I'm guessing that those are probably, most of them, at least 6 feet tall.
Okay. I just can't tell.
Is that, Melissa, is that about right?
They're probably
Closer to 8, okay.
Okay.
I mean, I think they're bigger trees. This is the row of trees that's adjacent to the parking lot.
Right.
And the others that you saw were out by the roadway. And there's 100 feet of them on either side of the drive entrance. And that's not even a requirement.
Mhm. Thanks. Other questions? No? Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we're ready for a motion.
Move approval, Core.
Second, Finnegan.
Discussion.
I'll go first. I was on the commission when this initially came through. And I think, like Mr. Hunziker says, that for those of us that have been around and involved in this for a long time, that condition that was originally on there, that is pretty normal to us. I mean, we're used to seeing that every day. So in my mind, there's really no conflict that these should have been 10 foot when planted. I understand that, we plant them at a smaller size and expect for them to mature. I am sympathetic to the surrounding neighbors, but I think that this is just kind of standard procedure for us. And I view this kind of more as a clarification point than anything else.
Oh, yeah.
I agree with Tracy, and obviously nothing we do here today is going to fix the fact that you were opposed to this use in the first place. I was on the commission as well, and remember there was a lot of discussion. I'm not surprised that something maybe got lost in the very lengthy and intense discussion that we had. I agree that, if you're familiar with this language, you see that it's a cut and paste, and you assume that it is City of Lincoln design standards. However, it's not. It was not spelled out, and it should have, and including one of us probably should have caught it, and we didn't. But the important thing is intent here, because I think it's a scary world where we make a mistake, and then we can't come back, and we can't fix that mistake, and we have to abide by whatever mistake happened because it's in a condition. I mean, that perfect example is the pool and what we talked about before. If we're saying, well, no, I'm sorry, we can't fix that because our ordinances are organic and they change, and conditions should be too, if they should be able to be corrected if they were erroneous in the first place. So I regret that we couldn't solve this in a way that made everybody feel like it was a good and fair outcome. But it is what it is, and I don't want to penalize the applicant after this has been approved.
Others? I agree. I was on the commission at the time too, and I remember the application. I don't remember discussion about the screen. I feel more responsible than anyone else. I should have caught it. I mean, I deal with this every day. But if we had caught it, I'm pretty confident that where we would have been when we passed that motion is where we are now. So I'm going to support the motion. I think it's a sensible way to get at this. I understand completely the issues with the adjacent neighbors. I think those issues go back deeper than just the screen, though, to the whole intent of the application as a whole. And that's something that we've already covered. So I'm going to support the motion. Please call the roll.
Okay, this is for conditional approval of county special permit number 16021A. Beckius?
Yes.
Core?
Yes.
Edgerton?
Yes.
Finnegan?
Yes.
Harris?
Yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Shear.
Yes.
Motion carried, 7-0.
At this time, anyone wishing to speak on an item not on the agenda may do so. Is there anyone? If not, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Oh, I do want to mention that this application, the application that we just called the motion